What's going on, guys? This is Joe Young coming at you with another video today. Today I wanted to do a remake on how to set up your CO2. I'm setting up a new tank with CO2, and the other video that I had up a long time ago was really outdated, and that was kind of like the beginning of when I was starting CO2. A couple tips that I wanted to give you guys that isn't in that video, and plus I wanted to shorten it and also make it a little bit easier. So here's the basic things that you'll need for setting up a CO2. First, you'll need some sort of cylinder or a CO2 tank. This could be the big one, so this is a 10-pound. You can get 5 pounds. You can get a paintball version, which is smaller. The one big thing about the big tanks versus the paintball ones is the actual fittings. The fittings will not fit certain regulators. You'll need adapters, so just keep that in mind if you get a smaller tank or a bigger tank and you're using certain regulators for different sizes. The other thing that you'll need is a regulator. So this is the regulator that I always like to use, carbon doser. You can get any regulator really. So the one thing that you'll probably need from your regulator is some sort of gauge that'll tell you how much PSI or how much CO2 is left in your tank. So that's a good indicator on when you actually need to refill your tank. The actual PSI that's output to your line. So this is a good indicator in terms of like how much you're actually putting out, because sometimes some CO2 will only come with one gauge, some will come with nothing, and you're literally blindly guessing. So you could be wasting CO2, you can be pumping too much, and that's when you have to kind of play with this and dial that in, and kind of sucks. So the next couple pieces aren't completely needed, but it definitely does help out, and I'll kind of explain the other pieces here. So the first piece is a bubble counter. So this will tell you how much, CO2 is getting pumped into your tank. Now, visually, this is like the only way you can tell. If you have a pretty accurate regulator, like what I have here, there is a little flash blinker here that will actually indicate how much bubbles that's actually being pumped into the actual tank. So if you have something that actually already indicates it via, LED or some sort of blinking light, you won't need this. But for the most part, a lot of people who are going to start with regulators are going to go with the fairly inexpensive ones, and you'll probably need some sort of indicator or some sort of bubble counter. So this is what this is. This actually acts as a bubble counter plus a check valve, so it won't reverse siphon any water back into the basically regulator slash tank if you have this turned off, and when you have a loop like this, it tends to draw water back into here. So that's actually a 2-for-1 here. And of course, if you don't have a check valve built into that bubble counter, definitely get one. Like I said, it stops from water from re-entering back into your regulator, and that can damage it, and back into your CO2, and you'll have just water in your CO2 tank, which can kind of suck. So at the end of the CO2 line here, you'll need some sort of diffuser. It comes in many different sizes depending on your tank. This is a nano one. The one I have set up in the bigger tank is like a lot bigger than this. So what happens is this disc here that's in this little diffuser, it basically breaks up the CO2 bubbles into finer CO2 bubbles so that it can dissolve into the water a lot easier. Now, if you directly pump CO2 out of the tubing directly into the tank, you'll get really big bubbles, and what will happen is you'll waste it because that bubble will travel really fast up to the water surface, and it'll break, and then you'll lose that CO2 right away. Versus if it was fine, it can break and it can basically dissolve into the water columns a lot easier. Now, while we're talking about tubing, there is a special tubing for CO2 actually. So you want to kind of buy, it's called pressurized CO2 tubing. So the tubing itself is a lot thicker than your normal air tubing that you will pump in with via the pump. So you definitely want to use CO2 tubing. So you can temporarily use air tubing if you don't have this in stock, or you need to wait a couple of days or something if you're ordering in the mail. The other one works fine. But what I've noticed is sometimes this can pop out at the end just because it's not pressurized, and also you can lose some of the CO2 via just the tubing. Before we actually go ahead and install everything, this last piece is actually really important for your CO2 setup. This is just a plastic crush washer. This goes in between your actual CO2 tank and your actual regulator. So actually some CO2 tank can actually take the permanent version of this. So it's basically a metal version, and you only have to buy one of these, and you don't have to ever buy any of these. So what happened with the plastic one is when you put it in between and you tighten it, it basically crushes, it basically forms into the shape of, the tank and the regulator. And basically every time you undo it to switch or, refill your CO2, you're supposed to replace this because over time this can, deform or whatever. So your CO2 can actually take the permanent washer here. Go ahead and buy it. It just saves you money, it saves you time. You can just put it in once and that's it. So just make sure you have some sort of washer in between the regulator and the actual CO2. So once you have your CO2 tank and that is actually filled, you can get these filled at your pet store. You can go to a beer brewery or to some brewery. They'll have CO2 there. So the one thing you want to double check with your CO2, especially once you get it filled, is this number right here. It's printed on the actual CO2. This is the weight of the actual CO2 cylinder without any CO2. So for example, this is a 10-pound CO2 tank. This thing weighs 14.3 pounds. So if I add 10 pounds of CO2, this is a way to check if your place is filling it correctly or overfilling the actual CO2. You find a measurer or a weight measure or whatever, drop this on the actual measure, and basically whatever this size tank is, which is 14.3, and if they add in 10 pounds of CO2, it should be 24.3 pounds is what this should weigh. So if it's actually over that limit, you may have to end up purging some of this so that you let some of the CO2 out. Because what happens is if they overpressurize the CO2, your safety valve here can break and you'll just basically lose all your CO2. Or it could be even worse, where when this breaks, basically this tank shoots and it can damage your cabinet, it can damage your walls, it can damage anything. I've had this overfilled before, not knowing how to check the safety of this, and actually it burst, and luckily it only dented the wall slightly, and I basically lost all of my CO2 like within 5 minutes. And it's super loud, it sounds like something's like going off, so you want to be very careful with this. Always check your number here. Go ahead and put it on a scale, weigh it. That's how you can spot check them, and also that's how you can check the actual store to make sure that they're not ripping you off or they're giving you too much, too little. So go ahead and put your CO2 tank under the cabinet or somewhere next to the actual tank so it's easy to access. Go ahead and hook the actual tubing into the regulator and run it all the way up into your tank. Now right here I do have my check valve in place, and as you can see I have my diffuser also hooked up here. The one thing to do note, I don't have a bubble counter in between because this one already has a LED light indicator. So that's something that you can actually add into your setup if you need one. Now go ahead and plug in the actual regulator. So once you have it plugged in, go ahead and turn on the CO2 completely. Now on here, depending on your regulator, if you have multiple gauges, you have one that shows how much PSI is actually in the CO2 tank, and the other one is how much you're actually outputting into the actual tube. So with the knob, you can actually adjust. As you can see here, the needle's going up. So with this knob here, you can actually adjust, and actually you can see here how much PSI is actually going into the tank. So I can turn it down, I can turn it up. Okay. So also on here, like I said, it has an indicator on how much actual bubbles. So this is my bubble counter. I can turn it all the way down. That's how much I'm actually pumping out. I can turn it all the way back here, and actually every 4 seconds it'll just dispense a bubble. So this could be adjusted. All right, so how do you know how much bubbles per second or how much CO2 you need to actually pump into your tank? The one thing that you probably need also in your tank is a drop check counter. As you can see here, I have two, one on this tank and one on this other tank here. And if you look at the actual colors, blue means there's basically no CO2 in your tank. Green means you have the perfect amount of CO2 in your tank, and that's 30 ppm. And then there's also another color spectrum to this, which is yellow. Yellow means you have way too much CO2 into your tank, and you're probably going to gas your fish if you have any livestock in the tank. So actually, how do you get from blue to green? So that depends on how much CO2 you're actually pumping into the tank. So when the CO2 comes on, you want to set it, and actually this takes some dialing in. I recommend probably a few bubbles per second initially, maybe like 3 to 2. And go ahead and every hour come back and check your drop check counter. Now when you look at this, if it's going towards the actual color that you want it to, aka green, then that's a good sign. Now, as it hits green, you also want to check to make sure that it doesn't go to yellows where you're pumping too much CO2. If you're not pumping enough, where it's not turning from blue to green fast enough, go ahead and turn up your CO2 bubble counters to a little bit faster. Now, if it's turning green too fast, go ahead and dial it back slightly and again, monitor it. And it may take a couple of days to tweak it and dial it in. So for example, in this tank here to the right, it took me about 3 days to dial this in. I actually played with it and adjusted it quite a few times to kind of get it right. So what would happen is it would turn green perfectly normal, but towards the end of the night, it would start to turn a little bit yellow because I was still pumping in at a rate of too much CO2 into the tank, and the actual plant wasn't consuming the CO2 fast enough, so I had to dial it back slightly. Once you have everything set up, make sure you have your CO2 on a timer. Now ideally you want to have the CO2 turn on 30 minutes ahead of your light schedule, and then also 30 minutes before your lights actually turn off. So by having the CO2 come on 30 minutes ahead, so it helps prep the tank with CO2, so when the lights turn on, the plants can automatically start consuming that CO2 along with the light. So when the CO2 is off 30 minutes before the light, the plants will help consume the rest of the CO2 that's in the tank, which then stabilizes your tank for night. Alright guys, I hope you guys enjoyed the remake version of how to set up your CO2 tank. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave it below. And until next time guys, peace.